Hi, we're Auction Conservation, and this is the Shoot Room Sessions. Welcome to the Shoot Room Sessions on tour.
Thanks for having me.
Can you tell people out there who you are and what you do?
Sure, I'm Pete Smith. I am a principal with Barnett Waddingham. I also head up our sustainable investment team. So Barnett Waddingham are one of the largest independent benefit consultancies in the UK, and we provide advice to a range of clients around pensions, insurance, charities, endowments, family offices. So the full spectrum.
How do we get there, Pete? Take me back to Where did you grow up? How did you get to this point?
Well, born in Ayr, moved up to Glasgow in early life. Really born and raised as far as it goes in Glasgow. I went to Glasgow University.
What did you enjoy school? What was school like?
Yeah, very much enjoyed school. And actually one of the things that come on to some of my folks, so my dad's a former professor in physics.
Oh wow!
So one of my years in school was in Geneva, which was interesting.
Fascinating.
Rest of it, good fun.
Okay.
Yep, keen enjoyment in sport.
What was it? Yeah, I was going to say, what was the young Pete about? Was it rugby, football?
It was very much football. You know, I probably was only about 5 or 6 years ago I realised I was never going to play for Scotland. But that boat has now sailed. But yeah, you live in hope.
No.
And my son has 2 left feet, so sadly I can't even live the dream.
I mean, we've been short of left wingers for a long time, so maybe the 2 left feet will help.
Yeah.
Okay, so university was
Glasgow.
Okay, to study?
Did statistics.
Okay.
Started out doing maths, realised that practical applications of that I just couldn't get.
My formative years were spent playing Championship Manager 24 hours a day, so I see the world through numbers, and even when it comes to recruitment, in my head I have that same grid of the player with each of the attributes and things like that. So there was definitely a love of numbers that informed my education.
Absolutely. And it was much the same. Yeah, it was much the same, but it was the practical aspects of it that I really enjoyed.
And when you were at uni, did you think about careers at that point, or did you just get through uni? What was it like from your perspective?
No, I and a group of friends wanted to be actuaries when they grew up. I went for a free afternoon in the booze in Edinburgh with my colleagues, my friends from uni, and essentially spent the next 11 years paying for it because I really liked what they said. And I ended up working for them for one of the large US consultancies for the next 11 years.
Okay, so people that don't know, what does an actuary do? What does that look like?
Yeah, it's so basically what we do is the numbers associated with trying to, how much money do you need in order to meet the future promises that you've met or that you've made. So we use a combination of what the outlook for interest rates are, what the outlook for inflation is, how long people are going to live, to put a capital value on the liabilities. And then more recently I'm now involved in how do you actually invest the money to try and generate what you need. My daughter keeps asking me what I do. I think she's boiled it down to, it started out doing hard sums, moved on to hard sums and how to make some money. And more recently it's hard sums, helping people make money and trying to influence them to save the planet. So pretty much a decent job description of what an investment actually does these days.
Fascinating. For the data geeks out there like myself, nothing sounds better than that. Like, being able to simulate and model the world in numbers is just an amazing thing.
Yeah, and I think it's bringing that sort of practical interpretation of the models is the bit that I really enjoy. And the whole field is constantly changing. So despite having done it since '88 and then the last 20 years in investment, things constantly change.
Fascinating. So we talked a little before we started about the difference between sort of the pure analytical side of it and the practical side of it, and certainly that practical application is the bit that really does it for you.
Yeah, it does, and I think some of that comes back to when I got involved in sustainable investment in the first instance.
When would that have been?
It's been about 5 or 6 years ago.
Okay.
I was actually thinking about that on the way across, there or thereabouts.
One of the beautiful things about the podcast is by taking me through your journey, it so often makes people remember and think of things that they haven't for such a long while.
Absolutely.
What was the catalyst for getting involved in the sustainable?
So I sort of, you obviously, a large part of the work we do is around risk and return. And then you start to realise that risks can be things other than financial. It's not just market crashes, it's market gains. It's actually things like climate change, nature, biodiversity loss. Those are systemic risks that we face that we need to allow for when we're thinking about the future. And so they've moved into that, and I think that coupled with the fact that my mother's from a farming community in South Ayrshire, and as I say, my dad's a former physics professor, but he comes from a former mining community just north of Glasgow. So I've seen the sort of social effect of what's not a just transition. And so I was brought up with quite strong social awareness. And the combination of that and what was happening with climate change just made me realise that there's a lot more to this. People were talking very much in silos around particular issues, but the sort of social one cuts across it. They're all very much intertwined, and it was a fascinating area.
Nice. So was 5 years ago the time when climate started factoring into the modelling work around this type of risk? So can you describe that change from it not being involved at all? What is the growth from it coming into how much is factored now?
So it went from not being factored in to an awareness that there was a challenge that needed to be addressed. Stepping forward from the challenge, the people at the front end of that, to an extent, we're taking a leap of faith based on common sense, in my view. And then we got things like TCFD come through, and further regulation and guidance sort of saying you should be thinking about taking account of this. And it was at that point we started to see a bit more around the modelling. We did an exercise where we looked at all the different types of scenario models that were out there and what lay behind them, and it became clear at the early stages of it there was more art than science necessarily sitting behind them. There were a lot of caveats that, in my view, were quite important. Things like few of the models, if any, actually allowed for the impact of mass migration that climate change might cause. And so we sort of come up with a model based around the Bank of England, and tried to make it almost like a heat map, so that it became a lot easier for clients to take decisions on what might happen in different scenarios.
So if you go back before 5 years ago, we're taking zero impact on climate will affect the model. 5 years ago, what percentage impact might?
It's not so much that it's not so much what percentage might. Well, I guess that the iteration in terms of the development of what the actions people took as they went for the low-hanging fruit first, understandably. So typically it was the equity holdings that they might have. Can they move those to a lower carbon, more transition-aligned approach? That followed on from there into probably a little bit on the private market side of things around renewable infrastructure. We then saw bond investment and the ability to sort of target that towards a transition developing, and then in the last few years, much more around biodiversity and natural capital.
Awesome. So that's a really useful segue into natural capital. What does it mean to you when you talk about natural capital?
So it means to me, it's the ecosystems, the habitats that contribute to society that we rely on. At its simplest, be that forestry, agriculture. From an investment perspective, that's where we tend to see things coming through. So forestry, agriculture, renovation of peatlands, areas such as that. But it's freshwater, seawater. It's all of the areas that we rely on in order to survive.
And as we sit here in 2024, in the middle of the year, how prevalent is natural capital to the investors and the groups and the funds that you are talking to? How prominent an issue is it?
In terms of the challenge, it's systemic, in my view. You know, it cuts across it. So the challenge is most definitely there. It's most definitely real. It's intertwined, and I don't think you can really distinguish between it and climate change. In terms of the actions that people are taking, I would say that there are a few investors or institutional investors that are taking significant steps in terms of actually doing it. I think we're much more at the learning and
announce something that you're going to do something but don't actually do it yet.
Well, I think it's more at the trying to understand what it is and why. Institutional investors tend to be quite analytical. You know, we're trying to go over the difficulty of what the data says. You know, how do you actually provide data in relation to natural capital assets? And actually, one of the areas I think's something of a challenge is that we use expressions like natural capital and biodiversity rather than much simpler language. You know, if we were to refer to farming, forestry, marine life instead of natural capital, you know, those are certainly forestry and agriculture are long-standing traditional asset classes. You know, getting people to understand that the focus on natural capital is around how do you do those, how do you invest in those, but manage them very well, I think is one of the ways we're trying to overcome some of the pushback.
So language is a barrier.
To me, language is a huge barrier, and it is across sustainability generally. You know, if you take the average, what's the average reading age in the UK is 12 or something of the kind. You know, into some of the expressions that used and the alphabet soup of
we do like
organisations. You know, it's
my favourite acronym story. So I used to work in the public sector, and not long out of university, I happened upon two people having a very vigorous debate about RSA. The problem was one was talking about restoring sustainable abstractions. The other one was talking about radioactive substances, and they were literally yelling about this acronym at one another. And they weren't even talking about the same thing. Yeah, it was. So when we hired a wonderful head of storytelling, we got someone who was outside of the sector explicitly, so they could go, "No, that doesn't mean anything. That's just letters."
But we see that at the minute. If you look at the ESG as the acronym, what it means in Europe, what it means in the UK,
ESG
is quite different from what it means.
The PNFD.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, VCM. We love it. We just, we should have an amnesty on acronyms moving forward.
I think that would be
you mentioned the data quality side of stuff, which I'm really interested in your views on. So as a younger man, I tried to see the world in too many black and whites and not recognize the amount of grey we work in. And I used to think if data wasn't really high quality data, it was of no value. The problem is, as you step into the real world, and we talked about the pragmatic side of things, I've learned that working with the data set you've got to try and improve it is better than waiting for a perfect data set that might never come. Yeah. What's your take on working with it?
Yeah, very much. don't let perfect get in the way of good.
It's a great quote.
And yeah, I think we can see data put up from a couple of different, as an obstacle from one of two reasons. One is that there is a genuine desire to better understand the data and be able to rely on the data and to make very data-driven decisions. I would consider that the traditional actuaries are the deep logic, blue personality types.
Yeah.
The other reason that data is quite often put forward is as a marker of discomfort in actually investing. There's I don't understand this. I know the data's not great. Even if the data was great, I still wouldn't understand it, but I'm not keen to do this. I'd rather move with the pack than be at the front edge of it.
So an acceptable shield.
That's exactly that.
Really interesting.
Shields are
often one of the things we've heard in this series of podcasts, talking to people sort of in and around natural capital, is that certainly in the financial sector, there's an absolute acceptance that it's fine to be wrong in the acceptable way rather than risk being right by being different. People want to be in that collective group. There's no blame cast if you invest in a safe asset that doesn't go well. Whereas if you invest in something emergent, there's some risk associated with that on a personal level. Is that something you've observed?
Yes, and it plays to the fact that there's a sense that you almost have to step into sustainable investment. It's something that people often ask. Do you have to accept lower returns? Is there some price to be paid for this? Is there some, this is something different. It's something new that we're stepping into, which doesn't allow for the fact that you have all these effects that are going to impact sustainability happening to what you already own.
You're talking about half the equation, right?
Exactly.
Suggesting the status quo is possible.
Correct.
Refusing to recognise, no, we're all in trouble anyway.
And that there's no price attached to status quo.
Yes.
So we very often get, the pushback of, I'm only interested in return, or I need to pay pensions. But, we then have to have a discussion around, what does return look like? Because you're looking for return today, tomorrow, next week, next year, up to 2030 to 2050. It's a series of returns, and the factors we're talking about will influence your return in each of these time periods. So, and the risks. And it's not just the factors, it's the policies underlining them as well. So there are multiple drivers. So the status quo doesn't come with no charge attached to it.
No. What are your thoughts on what might help people understand that there are two sides to that equation, that we can't just look left, we have to look left and right?
I think it's trying to dispel this idea that we have deep uncertainty attached to these areas, and actually more recognise the fact that on a day-to-day basis, investors are used to dealing with uncertainty, perhaps not at the level that we're talking about, but I mentioned earlier on, we look at the pathways of interest rate and inflation. Investors are now reasonably familiar with how to take decisions around that. It's by encouraging them to understand that they have been good at this in the past, they are aware of how to do it, we can then help them through the next step associated with the bigger systemic issues of climate change and biodiversity loss.
I was thinking about that when you talked about sort of data quality on things. It's a bit like, so is it possible to have an argument about whether we're going to see rises of 1.5 or 1.6 or 2 or 2.2? Yes, there are lots of academics that want to do that detailed work. It's shades of bad.
Yes.
So in the plus or minus on risk, it's all bad, it's just how bad. So rather than saying, well, the data's not there to know exactly how bad, cool, but we know it's going to be bad anyway, right? So let's do something about the macro level stuff rather than detail on the nuance.
Correct. And that is also what's it going to affect most. And I think too much of the discussion is around the problem, and the bad outcome, and there's not enough focus on the opportunity to get that first mover or first-ish mover advantage in the solutions.
Have you in your career seen one of those first mover opportunities that someone has jumped into really successfully or well, be it in a different industry or sector? I'm just interested in exploring what it was that gave them the confidence to jump.
Good question. I guess there was the tech.
I was thinking maybe tech or renewables, perhaps. I wasn't.
Tech, was one. I appreciate it was then followed by a bubble.
Yeah.
There was a bubble that burst. Arguably, when you look at the Magnificent Seven stocks now, it's come back. Renewables, yes.
So it predated me a little bit. My understanding on the renewable side of things was it was very much the sort of government conditions and subsidies that allowed that first jump.
Yeah.
And now a lot of those have dropped away. We've got an industry that's self-sustaining. You think we need something like that on the natural capital side?
I think it would help. I think we're fortunate in the UK that the certification process for carbon credits is robust and is viewed globally as being robust.
We've heard that internationally as well. It's been played back to us.
So that helps. There's a few states in the US, New Zealand, ourselves, California, where they're viewed as being credible.
Yeah.
And I think that's really beneficial.
The tech thing's really interesting. So I wrote a piece recently equating, and it was you mentioning the bubble that reminded me of it. There's a generally thought out pattern and cycle to how industries develop. So there's the sort of academic papers and ideas, and then startups, early adopters, and then a drop away. So a first bubble bursting, and then mass adoption, and then adaptation, and then saturation. So if you apply that same sort of cycle and curve to the internet and tech, we saw the growth of like the first .com bubble, it dropped, and then smartphones and social media and brilliant developed. So I equated the natural capital cycle to that same process. And if you apply the same thinking, we're at such an early stage of natural capital. We're in the early 90s of the internet, so we're on dial-up internet still. We're on AOL. There's no smartphones. There's no social media. We're in the early 90s where Steve Jobs hasn't even gone back to Apple yet. And if you think about the intricacies that we need to solve, and that's why this series of podcasts is so important, because while everyone was looking at the big .com websites, the things that were really moving things forward were the protocols that allowed computers to talk to one another, and the systems and processes that allowed online payments. Not the sexy stuff, but the real nuts and bolts of things that need to come in place. So I'm really interested in your views of what are some of those nuts and bolts. They're not sexy things, but the practical things that we need to see at a sort of micro level to bring a natural capital economy to life.
So speaking purely on from the sort of pensions perspective here, one of the recent changes has been the introduction of what they call implementation statements. They need to publish a statement each year that says how you have adhered to the investment principles that you've set out, and alongside that, or an integral part of that, is what you've done around voting and engagement. And that bringing in the need for reporting on voting and engagement raised the profile of that aspect of things and just stewardship generally. And you then have discussions around, okay, so what are our engagement themes going to be? And we see some relating to the impact on nature. And some of that is driven by the fact that, if you're engaging with a company, what they're doing around pollution, what they're doing around the environment generally comes with cost attached to it. And one of the definite changes that we're seeing is on consumer behaviour. And if consumers are changing what they're doing, companies are responding.
So do you think we're seeing members of pension funds more aware of where it's going and wanting to understand where their money is and what it's doing?
Yes, that has gone up. That has raised in profile. It would be massively overstating it to say that it's anything like a major, this is a significant percentage. I think we still have something like 90+% of pension scheme members in the UK who, if they've got a choice of what they invest in, follow the default.
Yeah.
And so, yes, we're seeing default strategies start to very much take this into account, but the actual direct member impact or influence is not really coming to the fore yet, but they do it on a day-to-day basis in the things that they buy.
Yeah.
So it's more indirect.
It's that's one of those facts that's both hideously depressing and also incredibly exciting because so we should all know better where our money is and what it's doing. However, just by 1 or 2% being more interested, boy, have we seen that have an impact. Imagine if 20, 30, 40% of members of pension funds said, no, I want my money doing the right thing in the right places. That would be transformative for the industry.
It would be interesting to know whether it's transformative on a positive basis.
Oh, interesting.
So if you, and this is my own view and my own experience is that member engagement is about what they don't want to happen, and the arguments are relatively binary, like fossil fuel bad, no fossil fuel.
Where are you
and so they don't the concept of having to help high emitting companies become low emitting companies and transition, because that's what we need in order to hit all the targets that we've got, is a real challenge.
I'm really excited about exploring this bit. So now I'm going to break. There's an exception to every rule, so I'm going to break my own rule to start with. I'm going to both appreciate that sweeping statements are terrible and not helpful, and I'm going to introduce a sweeping statement and ask your view on it. So we should all be divesting from all fossil fuel companies. Yes, no.
Personal view, no.
Because
we need natural gas to help smooth the transition so we can move to a fully renewable situation. Divesting from them doesn't help us achieve that. But I caveat that with we also need to be highly sceptical of the green messages that some of them are giving out.
It's so hard. So I often describe that my world is very much one of contradiction and compromise. If you'd have asked me a little while ago, I would have said, yep, absolutely, we should divest. And I think that was a naive, optics-focused view. So we cannot have a world anytime soon that doesn't have a prominent role for fossil fuels. And I don't mean from a transport perspective. Mm-hmm. I mean from a petrochemical perspective, the products, the services, the things that allow the world to function, the medical supplies and things like that are formed from those things. We need them until we find alternative solutions. I spoke at an event in the US a few weeks ago. There was an incredible professor from Yale called Professor Kelly Shue, and she's an expert in behavioral economics and specializes in the unintended consequences of decisions. Mm-hmm. It's a bit like you were saying, but whether it would have a positive or a negative.
Yeah.
And she said about divesting from fossil fuel companies, do we think the conversations are better if we're not there? And I just thought that was a brilliant moment of making you go, wow, if you take out the people who are minded about building a better environment and future, and all the conversations are about people who want to maximize profit at all costs, of course the conversations aren't better. What's really difficult is in the court of public opinion, certainly with the new generation coming through, and our talent base is that next generation of young people mm-hmm. coming through. I think they find it incredibly difficult if we were to partner with or sell carbon credits to fossil fuel companies.
Yeah,
it's so difficult.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think that goes to other areas, not just fossil fuel companies. Carbon credits should be used, in my view, as part of a net zero journey. To get rid of the emissions that you cannot otherwise reduce and abate. So very much down the, with the longer term in mind. They shouldn't be used to enable highly polluting companies to keep carrying on as they are without trying to change their businesses.
It's really difficult. But the businesses that have the ability to pay, the ones that should effectively be paying a form of climate reparations, are those heavy traditional industries. It is really difficult. Do you think we're anywhere near seeing pension funds and large institutions holding carbon credits, nature credits, biodiversity as an asset class within itself?
I had many a discussion around this, and I had a client, long-standing client, and one of the trustees used to bring out a card that he always kept in his wallet that said, "Never invest in anything you couldn't explain to your granny." And one of the challenges around carbon credits is for the very many investors in numeric terms, they simply don't have the resources to fully understand doing that directly. And so I think many of them will look at, how can I get access to these via more traditional asset classes like forestry, where it's an additive element to the way it's being managed, rather than going into funds that are specifically carbon credit.
So it's really interesting. And what we're trying to do on the carbon credit side of things is we are trying to make a leap in the quality side of things so that we can drag the entire respectableness of that market forward. So in the same way that Tesla went from the Clarkson days of an electric car being a milk float and ridiculed for it, you then had a little bit of progress with the Prius and it started to appear, and then boom, Tesla brought out a car that was world-renowned, car of the year, aspirational, incredible. It transformed things. We're trying to do that with carbon credits. So exactly as you described, for so many people, it's not tangible, it's not real, they can't understand it. So what we're bringing forward is, so over the next 2 years, we'll probably bring about 2 million tons of carbon credits, all UK based on land we own and manage for conservation purposes, and carbon credits that you can go visit. They're geo-referenced and located, they're independently insured and verified, and we're going to sell them on a project by project basis. So we have 11 estates across the UK, and we will sell one project, or maybe all 11, to one partner who will also get, alongside visitation rights and the ability to interact with them, a series of digital assets. So photography, videography, stories, narratives, podcasts alongside it, so they can help share the story of what they're doing, and in the process help their members or customers really understand the journey as well. Because I think in the absence of all those things, it's just not a real thing for people.
Yeah, and I think that's absolutely necessary. Is one of the main attractions for natural capital, nature, is it's very tangible. Everyone knows what it looks like. When we move to the carbon credits, there's not enough of an understanding of the link between nature and climate change as yet. And one of the things we need to move away from, in my view, is the view that climate change is an emissions accounting exercise. On the one hand, we've got an industry that focuses on real world change almost in its entirety, and the financial implications of the actions you take to try and position yourself in the right way for real world change are a second order discussion. The nature's much the same. We need to have the focus on what is it we're trying to do, real world change. What are the different iterations and steps we can take to move towards that? The first element can be engagement on the listed equities you've got. The second is around, can you invest in some of these traditional asset classes that have got the sort of, that are managed well with the carbon rewilding, wildlife pathways and so on, sort of embedded into them, as we move up towards the more carbon credit markets that are out there, sophisticated investors get it, absolutely. I wouldn't want, but they are in the minority in numbers term, but in the majority in asset size. So it's some of that. How do we bring everyone, or do we even try to bring everyone with us? My view is that we should, because there will be a natural, if consumer changes are happening, people shouldn't be burying their head in the sand and saying, well, just carry on with the status quo. And we should be starting to recognise that, partly because of the opportunity, the investment opportunity that sits behind it.
So unpick that a little bit for us. How do you view the opportunity?
Well, if you look at the sort of where we sit today, and one of the challenges that we have is that we think about climate change, we think about social change, we think about nature change. They're all intertwined. And I think we need to stop thinking in silos and start thinking on a more system-led.
You're literally articulating our business.
System-led basis. Yeah. So one of the things we're looking at is some of the Stockholm Resilience Institute work on planetary boundaries.
Yes.
So if you look at the planetary boundaries and you look about where we are relative to the planetary boundaries, we start to see, and you think about that in the context of the SDGs, and you think about that in the context of government commitments. You can start to see where we may get policy pressure coming through. And policy pressure impacts asset values today. The effect might not be for 20, 30 years, but it's the values are hit today.
That's been a big learning point for me. So my background is environment and data. Up until the last 18 months, 2 years, I had very little work directly with the finance sector. One of my biggest learnings of my time in the environment sector, nearly a decade was spent working with government on the environment agenda. And the government never did what they committed to do environmentally. I saw year upon year a pot of money being announced for a certain specific thing that had such conditions attached around it that you could never access it. So year on year, they just announced it again as additional funding because you couldn't get to it. So I didn't really, when I was ever asked about government policy, I said, well, I don't expect them to do anything. And if they do, it's not going to be helpful. And then putting on a hat of understanding it through the lens of financial markets and the financial world, it's the most important thing.
Yeah.
It gives investors that feeling of confidence and credibility, and all of it's a perception. I don't believe any of it's real, because the shocks that you mentioned earlier, we've had COVID, we've had Trump in the White House, we've had Ukraine, we've had all these things that are globally significant events in a close proximity. Anyone who had Trump in their model 10 years out for changing the world would have been very brave. And did you have Trump in your?
No. No, not personally.
Is he in the model for next year?
I don't think it. Well, I think let the markets decide.
Yeah, that's true.
Is the thing. And actually, to go back to that point around the financial markets. I mean, I mentioned the stepping into something. If you just look at what you hold today, embedded in that is a view of how well the market can predict the pathway of future policy.
Yeah, whether you're consciously aware of it or not, is an expression of that future.
It's all properly priced in.
Yeah.
And I just don't believe that's the case. Yeah, I don't believe that's the case. I think we are, and because of that, I think there is that first mover advantage around it. There is still a tailwind associated with this. There was doing some preparation for this earlier on, and timing could not have been better. There was an article popped up around a survey that Deloitte had carried out, and it was looking at private equity firms and mergers and acquisition, and it was talking about the number that ruled deals out on the basis of ESG, and it was in the sort of high 80s. Up significantly from the last time they did it.
Otherwise, just the risk of sitting on a stranded asset is so huge. Yeah, that you just. We've been talking to people who want to invest in carbon credits as a hedge against future expansion of regulation.
Yeah.
So we've seen so we're recording this June 24, and we've seen in the last few weeks government in England launching a consultation on whether voluntary carbon credits of nature-based variety should be integrated into the regulated market. That'll be transformative. And then that will only lead to the broadening of what's regulated. And as that grows, then we start to put a meaningful price on carbon. Then the carbon markets have real teeth. And as soon as a carbon price becomes punitive, that's when we get change.
Yeah.
Because at the moment, it's too easy for a lot of people to buy low quality credits that aren't. We had a lovely quote from a private bank that spoke to us that they want to buy reassuringly expensive carbon because then they know it's a value.
Yeah.
Whereas if you buy $1 carbon credits, what are you buying?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I think that's right. But when you talk to people in the carbon credit markets, when you talk to the oil companies, the impression is that the price of carbon is only going one way; it's going up. But the concept of hedging your carbon price is still very, very embryonic. But it's an area that I think will grow, and it will grow certainly in the pensions industry. If it's going to grow, it will grow when insurers start building in some of that type of thing into their annuity pricing.
Exciting announcement last week with Triodos Bank have partnered with a Canadian pension fund to explore a natural capital mandate around things, which is really exciting. I want to just touch on your sort of early and first mover advantage comment. So we have a portfolio that's just around £150 million under management, about 45,000 acres of assets. Scale has always been a barrier to this for entry into the market because environment projects are so small in comparison. You can't deploy the capital quick enough. Now, this isn't our model because our sort of principal investor group love each of these estates. They've got a personal connection. We're not looking to sell. But every week I get a question, are you looking to bring that whole portfolio to market? And I think, we're probably adding 50-ish million a year to that portfolio. So in a couple of years' time will be 2026, we would have $250 million at least portfolio. I think that'd be a quite exciting time to bring something like that to market because it's a quantum of a scale to allow the big houses to be interested. And it's real enough that it takes away such that risk. How would you see something like that affecting the market?
Yeah, I think there's two aspects to it. One is we need more availability in order to be able to hedge. The second is that one of the dialogues, one of the discussions that we don't hear enough about is how much do you need? So when we've done some work around, what do you actually need per 100 million of equities that are in a low carbon fund to actually ultimately offset the residual emissions that you've got. Yeah. And we've got something like an allocation of about 3% to it being there or thereabouts, depending on approach, somewhere between 3 and 5. So we're not talking about this having to be a really material part of the overall asset mix.
That's
the bit that's not, this is not saying you need to go and buy enough forestry to cover the whole of New York. Yeah. It's around, you need this sort of level of, if you've accepted the fact you've got your emissions today and you've got a downward trajectory, then you're ultimately going to be left with 5-10%. It's that sort of thing you're trying to offset. Buy them today at the lower cost. It's not, people aren't doing it yet, but it's got to be the pathway that we're on.
But it's such an acceptable premise because you're asking for an effective risk management tool to be added, a 3% contingency on something on a risk management perspective. Again, such a catastrophic risk scenario is super cheap, whatever price point you're getting that. That's really fascinating.
But I think to go back to your point about 1.5 and 2, and it's bad and worse. Yeah. And 2.5's worse again. And it's the context.
Yeah. And don't worry about it because we'll all be dead.
Well, it's exactly that. It's the extent to which we pass a point at which it's worth worrying about. So when it gets, was it Bill Gates' book? He talks about the last time it was at 4 with crocodiles at the North Pole. Yeah, that's one of the scenarios we're made to inverted commas try and model.
I'm going to steal crocodiles at the North Pole as a title for an article because I think that's going to be fantastic. It's really interesting. Pete, thank you so much for coming in, and I've loved the deep dive into the practical data and the nuts and bolts of what we're doing, and that's the beauty of this series. We want to expose the wider populace out there to all the thinking and the great minds and the application that's looking at natural capital. So thank you so much for sparing the time. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Yeah, I've really enjoyed it. Thanks.
Thank you very much.
Podcast.